a very considerable expert on terrorism and international security, joins me next. He's Dr. Jonathan Leader Maynard from the prestigious University of Oxford. Dr. Jonathan, thanks very much for coming on the show.
No problem.
I just saw on the television there that the French Prime Minister says there were no security failings in the situation in Nice last night. I find that very difficult to believe. Where do you stand on that, first of all?
Yeah, I find it a bit difficult to believe as well. I mean, I think one of the very important things that I have to say at this stage is, of course, we still know very little at the moment. So it's very hard to make determinate statements one way or the other. But I certainly think one of the things that already the French government is under scrutiny for is, this is a government that's in a state of emergency, supposedly.
Yes.
Which is meant to, empower them to give a wide range of government powers to prevent terrorist attacks. Clearly, this made no difference in this case. And certainly, I think there are questions to be asked over, there was meant to be a security cordon around Bastille Day events in Nice, quite how that was breached, how a person completely unauthorized with a lorry was allowed to drive through and cause such damage is an important question. It's very hard to say at this stage what potential failings there may have been by French security services or if they were definitely to blame. But I certainly share your question mark around that statement, that confident statement so early on in the day.
Yes, I mean, no one can, Simon Jenkins in The Guardian today very properly pointing out that no state at all can legislate against a madman with a motor vehicle driving at people. But in a state of emergency, when, as you say, the state has given itself extra powers, never mind ordinarily, an event attended by tens of thousands of people, so emblematic of the French Republic as the Bastille Day celebrations, either that truck should have been stopped before it got onto the thoroughfare, or it should have been checked. Now, I hear, I can't confirm it, and you're right to say there's a lot yet we don't know, but I hear that he was stopped, and he said that he was carrying ice cream, and he was waved on. Now, either way, either he wasn't stopped or he was stopped and waved on. It just seems incredible to me that that vehicle could have been filled with explosives and we could have been talking about the death of thousands of people tonight. How can that be a non-security failure?
And I think, one of the important things, I think, from a security analysis perspective on this attack is it really reemphasizes there are kind of two very different kind of terrorist attacks that tend to go on at the moment. There's those which seem to be primarily quite sophisticated, organized by a network, often linked to an organization like Islamic State or Daesh or whatever we want to call them, or Al-Qaeda. That tend to be quite ideologically motivated by highly radicalized individuals. And then there's a very different kind of attack, which tends to be by a loner, an individual, often not very ideologically or religiously motivated. I mean, it's interesting how quickly people have been worrying about the position of Islam in French society. I mean, by all accounts, from what limited information we have about Mohamed Larouche Bailel, the attacker, he was not a particularly religious man at all. And I think part of the problem here is that the security lens continuously fluctuates from one of these attacks to the other. So when we think about the kind of Paris attacks, we think about, this is intelligence failings, it's about our failure to predict and track at a highly sophisticated intelligence transnational level this sort of very, very sophisticated attack. And that can blind us to actually what is often a much simpler problem, which is very basic security around a public event that can allow an individual with very simple resources, a knife or a single gun or weapon or a truck or whatever, to do a lot of damage. And I think part of the real challenge for security services is integrating their response to these two very different kinds of threats, the highly sophisticated coordinated attack and actually the fairly simple non-intelligence, non-highly organized, very planned attack that actually needs kind of a very, very different, much simpler and more kind of on-the-ground competence in order to repel it and protect the public.
Now, if this were, God forbid, to happen in England, in Britain, in London, perhaps the most likely, how prepared are we to deal with it. I have today been at Heathrow Airport. I have driven past Buckingham Palace. I've driven past Parliament. I've been in a TV studio right next door to MI5 and right across the river from MI6. I don't myself see any signs of the fact that our threat level is officially severe, i.e., a terrorist attack is highly likely. I don't have a lot of confidence that we could stop something like this or bring it quickly to an end, which is the next best thing. What about you?
Yeah, well, I think it comes down to this distinction between sort of two kinds of threats and two kinds of response. I think what tends to happen when we're on a high level of security alert is a lot of incredibly sophisticated efforts and resources are put into play on the kind of intelligence gathering side, the security services side, trying to track, and particularly track through internet communications, potential terror plots worldwide. Yeah. I think we're very good at that kind of thing, and that's grown enormously in sophistication over the last few years. What I think this attack really reminds us of is that that's not necessarily enough to really deal with the problem. And actually, the kind of proposals that governments often suggest to us, big infringements of sort of civil liberties, new surveillance powers, and so on and so forth, may be less important than just how do we protect public spaces? Yeah. How do we set up barricades in the right areas? What kind of security checks do we use surrounding an event like Glastonbury, for example? And the irony is that actually those are probably the kind of policies that are much less controversial. I think the vast majority of people in Britain and elsewhere feel like, trading off very important civil liberties and giving the state a lot of surveillance power to protect us against terrorism, that's kind of controversial and difficult and a real dilemma. But actually, a bit of inconvenience in order to protect public spaces isn't so controversial. Most of us would be willing to trade that for more security. So I think that's going to be, as we're increasingly seeing these kind of low-level, loner, unsophisticated attacks going on, thinking about the nature of the response on that side is important. I would still broadly say that it is something I think we do well. I think it's very important that we keep these kind of attacks in proportion. This is a terribly tragic event, but our societies are amongst the most, very most safe societies in the world. The vast majority of terrorist death and violence that goes around in the world is not in Europe, it's not in North America. It's in countries like Iraq and Syria and Nigeria and Afghanistan that are really bearing the brunt of terrorist violence. So we are remarkably safe by comparison. But certainly every single time an attack like this goes on, we need to learn a lot of lessons.
Indeed. Let's assume that we have leaders who are not good at learning lessons. I know it's quite far-fetched as an idea, but let's assume it. President Hollande effectively said that France will now become more deeply involved in foreign wars in Arab countries, in Muslim countries. Is that likely to work better in the future than it has in the recent past?
I think it's very hard to give a sort of overall answer to that question. I mean, the Western military involvement in foreign countries has been a phenomenally mixed bag, in my view. I mean, there have been complete catastrophes. I mean, it's very hard to say that a huge quantity of the modern terrorist threat we face, doesn't derive from the immense catastrophe of the invasion of Iraq, which I think almost all security analysts would see as deeply at root for all of these problems, a complete catastrophe. On the other hand, there is some evidence, we need to be, again, very cautious about this, but there is some evidence that that ISIS or Daesh, whatever we choose to call them, have been in a position to cause incredible violence in the Middle East and promote violence globally, and that they are beginning to be pushed back. They are beginning to lose territory, to shrink in size, to shrink in power. So it's hard to give a sweeping statement. I mean, we do an awful lot wrong in foreign policy, and occasionally, in my view, we do a few things right. But certainly in terms of an attack like this, I mean, it looks like Lahouj Bailel was not particularly linked to any organized network. These kind of individuals who, whether it's through ideological radicalization or personal life dysfunctionality, decide to resort to violence, that's the kind of threat that certainly no foreign policy is going to be able to deal with that effectively, either, not intervening or intervening. I just don't think these kind of individuals are particularly moved by that kind of question. So this is really, I think, the kind of threat which requires, as I say, the more mundane responses, really. But, I mean, often the mundane responses are actually the most powerful ones.
Indeed. Dr. Jonathan Leader Maynard, thanks very much for joining us, an expert in terrorism and international security from the University of Oxford.